So a very warm welcome and a good morning to everybody and a good evening to those of you who are joining us from North America. My name is Glenn Lim, the Senior Program Director for Asia Pacific. And joining me today are my colleagues from the Asia Pacific MedTech Innovator Company. And that's Frederick Nienberg, the Managing Director, Bernice Tan, the Lead of Marketing and Events, as well as Nerissa Yu, newly joined member of our team, taking care of the programs segment of the company. I will introduce our two wonderful panelists in a moment, but first, let me welcome everybody to the sixth webinar of this series. We will be and are live streaming this on YouTube and on LinkedIn at the current moment, where we will then part ways at the 1 hour mark at 11 o'clock with our public audience. But for our cohort companies, please remain for the remainder of the 30 minutes Q&A sessions with our panelists itself. For all our audiences, kindly rename yourselves in the following format: your name dash your company name for us to be able to more easily identify you. Now, today's topic is going to be a very exciting topic. It is on PR, public relations, and brand management. And these discussion topics are largely based on the survey that everybody has filled up at the beginning of this accelerated program itself. And just a gentle reminder, as and when you do have questions, please indicate them in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will get to them during and at the end of the webinar itself. Right, so joining us today, I'm very excited to welcome Emma, the Managing Director of Spurwing Communications, as well as Shavit, the CEO of Thrixon, who is also our alumni company itself. Now, just to explain a little bit more, to give everybody a bit more context, so the beginning of this year or the end of last year was when Shavit actually came to MedTech Innovator to ask for a connection to a PR and a marketing agency. And that's where we recommended Emma from Spurwing Communications itself. And they've gone on to work on a few projects, and notably would be the big news that was released in April this year. So Shavit, congratulations on your successful $7 million fundraised announced this year. And this big news was actually announced and appeared on multiple platforms like Business Times, E27, Tech in Asia, Deal Street Asia, and at least 5 other media platforms and outlets itself. All right. So just wanted now to maybe get Shavit, you to introduce yourself first.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Shavit. I'm the CEO of Thrixon. So Thrixon is a startup based here in Singapore. We were an alumni company of the MedTech Innovator 2023 cohort and are actually participating in the US market entry program as well this year under MedTech Innovator. So Thrixon is developing a multiplex point-of-care diagnostic platform. So our core technology is actually a protein engineering technology that allows us to replace antibodies with our proprietary reagents for these tests. So the company's it was founded in Singapore as a spinoff from SMART, the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, and been operating now for about 3 years in Singapore. As for myself, my background is actually more in the startup space on the commercial product and strategy side. So have kind of a diverse experience. I was with a startup doing computer vision and AI for retail. So did that for nearly 10 years in Singapore before joining the founding team here at Thrixon.
All right, thank you so much. And of course, we have with us Emma. Emma, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your company, as well as your background in marketing communications, and maybe specifically highlight how you work with healthcare startups and the likes?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn, and good morning, good evening to everyone that's joining today. So I've spent almost 2 decades in communications in Asia Pacific. My first decade spent in Hong Kong and the latter here in Singapore. And I've spent the majority of my time helping big global and startup brands in the healthcare and technology sectors to build their corporate reputations and trust with multiple stakeholders across the region. Spurwing Communications is an independent comms agency. We specialize in healthcare communications. So we have a very niche focus area, working with everyone from MedTech to big pharma, health tech, right across the spectrum, communicating with a variety of audiences, whether it be patient advocacy, medcoms teams, the PR side of things, dealing with the media. So there's a whole spectrum, but very specifically geared towards healthcare comms. We're 10 years old, and 10 years ago, our founder spotted a niche in the market for, that specialist communications, healthcare being a highly regulated market. It's a very, specific, toolkit that you need in order to communicate in this space. We have a team of strategists, pharmacists, journalists, design, branding experts, medical writers, so we can cover the whole plethora of the needs of our clients. Spurwing is known for working with, successful startups. We have worked with a couple of startups that came out of Singapore that made their way to the US, Advanced MedTech and Aslan Pharmaceuticals, a couple to note there. It's easy to kind of, from a comms perspective, to kind of not look at the startup scene, but for us, we really enjoy it. We really enjoy going on a journey with the startups, all the way from funding through to IPO, which we have done as well.
And no, thank you so much for that. And I think it's also worth highlighting that you guys, having worked with fellow healthcare players, I think you guys would also understand this space a little bit more and be able to provide, I think, more relevant and good advice to healthcare-related startups and companies as well. Maybe we'll just start this off by also asking you, Emma, as a seasoned professional, right? You spoke a little bit more about the brand story of having help a company from the beginning and raising funds all the way up to IPO, right? What would you say is a good branding or good brand strategy or good brand story? And do you happen to have any good examples to share?
It's a very big question. You also make me feel very old when you call me seasoned. It's a very large question. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more later, about the difference between the branding, the brand management, the PR, the marketing. But ultimately, good branding for me as a comms person goes beyond a logo and a tagline, which, again, we need to kind of delineate between marketing, PR, branding, for that reason. So a lot of what I do is crafting the meaningful narrative that helps companies reflect their mission and vision and kind of what they want to say, but also how does that translate and resonate with the audience in a really emotional and rational way. So it's not just about the product or the services that are being offered, but you have to create a story around the experience to build the trust in brands with the audience, and sometimes that's not, it's not very tangible, but it is definitely more than just the brand name. So for us, when we're putting together a brand strategy or a campaign narrative, it's about what do we want the audience to think, feel, and do as a result of what we're communicating. So that's kind of where we start our process. So a strong brand story should definitely be consistent. It needs to be relatable. Of course, where we can, encourage it to be as inspiring as it can be, and differentiating in what is a very crowded marketplace. And again, that exercise can be a challenge, but one that we work through with our clients. I was, trying to think about an example that would obviously resonate with the audience today in the MedTech space. And again, we could talk about this question alone for an hour. But one company that really sticks out to me is someone like Stryker. And I'll tell you why. Stryker, actually was founded in 1941. So it's a company that's been around for quite some time. But if you look at Stryker and the branding, and just taking a look at their website, for example, it really has it has a really interesting brand. Often when you kind of seeing healthcare brands kind of go for blues and whites, because that's kind of representative of the industry. But even just in terms of Stryker's colors, they're kind of non-typical healthcare. They have this yellow, which really stands out. So just from a branding perspective, it looks really fresh. It looks different. It's very striking. And you can see immediately what they do. The first thing on their website is a video clip, actually, which is centered on patients and people. And then we kind of get into what they do as a MedTech company. And they're very upfront with, you know, the patient story and how many patients they serve. So I think it, for me, is a real standout. It really does kind of differentiate from other brands out there. And they've evolved over time as well. And I think that's a really key thing as you kind of grow as a brand, particularly some of the big pharmas as well. You know, been around for a number of years. You've got to also evolve your brand with the timing, you know, what you're doing with the trends. And I think Stryker's, yeah, it's really effective in terms of balancing its history, its innovation, but also it feels very fresh and forward looking, and not just about the product itself, but actually the impact they're having.
No, and that's wonderful. And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, when you mentioned inspiring, it also got me to think a little bit more about Trixon. And as a younger company, right, a much younger company, I also wanted to maybe pick your brain a little bit more, Shavit. And as a founder and a CEO, someone that I think our cohort can very much easily relate to. What does branding mean to you? And what would you say would be Trixon's branding strategy or brand story in this case?
I think maybe I'll start with sort of what does branding mean to me. And I think, you know, I think branding means different things at different stages of a company. So for example, you know, to Emma's example on Stryker, Stryker is a company that's been around since 1940. It's a very large company with many different departments, many different stakeholders. So branding there means something very different than what it does in a small startup that's founder-led. In our case, and I think this is true for any kind of founder-led startup, I think that your personal brand as a founder and the brand of your company are very tightly correlated. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when you are essentially facing any kind of stakeholder, you are the brand of the company. If you're the CEO, if you're the founder, you are the face of the company. You are the thing that is most associated with the company in that early stage. And I think that's where having a brand that represents the founders and that feels authentic to the founders. And I know that sort of term authentic seems, you know, it's a bit cliche, but I think that to me, what that means is that there is a clear connection between the people that you see and the brand that's being represented. Because I think sometimes you get, you know, you can go on one of these online tools that uses AI and design a logo and a PowerPoint presentation, and that's great. But then if you see the person in front of you and this branding that you see and they just don't connect, that's where I think you get that inauthenticity. And I think that can be a challenge. So I think that branding at an early stage is about creating a look and feel and a messaging that makes sense for who you are and how you communicate and seems cohesive to the people that you're speaking to. So that there's just a, you know, continuity between the person that they're seeing in front of them and the brand that's being presented to them. Obviously, as a company grows, the brand can't be tied to specific individuals because the face of the company changes. There's a lot more stakeholders. The brand needs to be much more representative of a larger company. So that's something that has to change and evolve with time. But I think certainly for early stage companies and where Trixon is, the brand has to be something that tightly resonates with the people who are the face of the brand in that early stage. So I think that's kind of how I would look at the branding side of it from the perspective of a startup.
And if I can just build on that a little bit, and I think Shavit made some really good points, particularly about, are you building the brand around a founder? Yes, early stage, but that later stage is really important because there needs to be some objectivity, you know, when it comes to branding and PR. And, you know, founders can be quite protective about, their businesses. I think this is where Thrixon has a great balance because, I think you mentioned it earlier, Shabi, a commercial, not a non-commercial founder or someone who has an outside kind of CEO coming in. It makes a huge difference because there is a lot more objectivity. Founders are just, you're quite attached to kind of what you're building, but as you grow, as you say, Shavit, people are going to move on and the brand needs to be kind of everybody, not just one person. And I also can speak from experience as a startup independent agency from 10 years ago, our own brand being built in that way, and me coming in as that kind of objective person to continue to build Spurwing's brand as a whole, not just around our founder as well. So that's really, really important. I think objectivity in branding as a founder is really important.
Yes. No, I think
but I think rightly so as well. And maybe Shavit, I could also ask you if your background is definitely not in marketing and branding specifically, right? And I think a lot of our founders, especially in this healthcare space itself, will not necessarily have a relevant marketing or branding background. So I just was really curious, what role do you think marketing and branding and PR plays in Thrixon?
So I think first of all, there's a question of defining marketing, PR, brand strategy. I think that's something that can sometimes be a little bit vague. And again, I think it's something that evolves with the needs and the stage of the company. If you're talking about a large established company, say Stryker, for example, all of these areas are very distinct disciplines that are very clearly defined in terms of how they look at them and how they approach them and what they encompass. I think in a startup, that's often not the case. Ultimately, I think it's about essentially any communication that you're having with any external stakeholders. That is the kind of the primary objective of it. But I think that also as your company grows and your team grows, it's also important from an inward facing point of view, because these are the things that are setting the tone of the company, setting the messaging of the company, the way that you want to be perceived by the outside world. And that also becomes more important internally in terms of your different stakeholders. So, I think in the case of Thrixon, right now, obviously, we're pre-commercial. We're not yet able to sell our solutions. So from the perspective of marketing, we're not out there trying to get customers or generate sales. So our objectives are very different. Our objectives are creating awareness, with the key stakeholders that we're going after, which is, in our case, largely in the earlier part, the investment community. So wanting to be able to build those relationships and connections with the kinds of investors that we want to get on board to help us along in our journey. And then with the various stakeholders that we're looking to engage with, whether it's healthcare systems, potential collaborators. So really kind of building out the story of Thrixon. So, the way I look at it is we're telling a long-term story here. It's not about we're trying to generate sales tomorrow. We're trying to start to engage with these different stakeholders, take them along on the journey that we're going through as a company and that evolution. So starting with the early part, celebrating, the milestone that we had when it came to a fundraise, getting the right engagement around that, slowly building up that story when we're ready to start sharing more of our, for example, clinical results, engaging more stakeholders so that when we get to that point where we're ready to start engaging commercially, and we actually want to go out there and do sort of proper marketing for the purpose of generating sales, we built a foundation on which we can then go and do that, where people know who we are, they know the journey that we've been through, and we've sort of built up that, that demand and that anticipation before we're even ready to start engaging with them when it comes to anything that is commercial. So I think that's kind of the way that we would view it.
And I think you brought out a really interesting point on whether a company should really focus on marketing or branding a company or versus marketing the product that you're going to put on the market eventually. And in this case, it seems that you guys are focusing a little bit more about marketing the company over the product.
Yeah, I think that obviously that consideration depends a lot on what it is that you're developing. In our case, we're focusing on developing our technology platform.
Mm,
And we want to be known first and foremost for our technology platform.
mm,
So we have our platform, and then we have specific applications that we're developing on that platform. But from a, certainly from an outward facing perspective, from a branding perspective, we want to be known for our technology platform. So that's where we put the focus. Different companies might have different considerations. If you have, for example, a product that's solving a very specific targeted problem, you may want to focus more on that because that's going to resonate more with your target audience. So, I think different companies will have different considerations. For us,
mm,
we're very clear that what we're trying to build out is a platform. So we want to focus on that as opposed to specific applications.
mm. Yeah. So, Emma, would you say that there is that distinct choice between branding the company versus the product, or is it a determination of whether you are B2B or B2C kind of company?
No, absolutely. There's many considerations. I think Shavit's touched on a number of them. And this doesn't tend to fall into my wheelhouse specifically, but and there are a lot of, I think, commercial considerations as part of this process as well, the market competition. You need to look at your competitors' branding strategies as well. Are they doing branded house, or are they doing houses brand? What's the long-term vision? Is there an exit strategy? Therefore, if you've gone with a house of brands, do you look to kind of, I guess, exit, a product by product, or are you going to, exit the whole company? There's lots of different things to consider. I think resource allocation is also a huge one, looking at your resources, the budget, the time, the talent, which that will also determine your branding strategy and your capacity for branding and marketing and PR around whether you're doing it for the single brand or you're going to do it for every product and service that you offer. I think you've got brand equity is a big one, and often the brands that we work with, we're definitely are, a branded house, because the time, the equity in the brand itself is much more, important than the actual product or service. So there's, I don't know, there's, you need to consider the flexibility, you might, start out as a house of brands, or vice versa, depending on which way your strategy shifts. I think there are legal and regulatory considerations, that may impact your decisions on whether you're branding a product, right? Because when we're communicating, often you can't mention the product name in print. I mean, when we're working with, big MedTech or big farmers, we can't use the brand in the media. You're telling stories through patients, or often paid advertorial because you can't mention the brand. So again, there's so much to consider there, and it's not just a branding and marketing decision. I think it's a commercial decision.
No, and I like how you've mentioned the commercial aspect of this as well. And with a lot of companies growing from nobody taking care of PR and marketing to the initial traction that you have, and now you realize, right, that branding and marketing is really important, and you really start to embark on that. But I guess the big question that then a lot of people have when they begin this journey would also be the role that branding in for medical device or digital health company play in eventually that customer acquisition stage of it, right? And the kind of relationship that branding has to sales. Because ultimately, branding is the face of a company, but sales is also the lifeblood of the company, that many people would say. So what would you say is maybe the relationship between branding and eventually customer acquisition itself? Shavit or Emma?
Yeah, I'm happy
Shavit?
to kind of give that one a crack. Again, I think it really depends on what it is that you're doing. So, I think that, for example, in a company like Thrixon, where we want to have that brand recognition, we're trying to, and as I said, build out a technology platform where ideally we want, our end users to not just be using one product from us, but be using a suite of products. I think that branding becomes very important. in terms of them thinking about, this is my go-to solution, or this is the platform that I want to use. So it's really important to have that recognition of the brand that's behind it and the experience that comes with using that brand. And I think that's where, you talk about branding of medical devices. Branding is not just your logo and your marketing collaterals. Branding is the entire user experience of using your product or solution. So, if I have a brand that feels very inspiring and futuristic, and then I deliver a product that feels like it's a gray box from the 1980s, there's an inconsistent brand experience, and that's going to be, detrimental, I think, when it comes to engaging with the ultimate consumers and customers. So I think that it's something that you need to view as a end-to-end process. Your brand is the experience that people have in engaging with your everything from your initial sales all the way through to the user experience of actually using your product. And of course, how that relates to patients, depending on, again, on what you're doing, and if your brand is something that is visible to patients. So I think depending on how much engagement you have with different stakeholders along that value chain, the importance might vary. For example, if you're making a very particular surgical device that the only people who really engage with it are surgeons of a very particular specialty, maybe your brand isn't as important as being able to highlight certain aspects of your product. But I think that, the larger the pool of stakeholders who you are engaging with and who interface with your brand, the more important that becomes. And again, the more important that consistency of the brand experience becomes.
So I guess in that case, you really want to resonate with your target audience, right? Prevent as much as possible the disconnect of what they feel. Emma, you're about to say something. No, Emma, you're muted.
Sorry. When Shavit and I first started talking, and we were building kind of the funding story, which seems quite straightforward, but I have to say, it's not, because there are a lot of the things we're talking about today were considered during this process. And this was kind of one of them. I think we were talking about Shavit when we were building it. Was like, I was like, what's the platform called? So what's the name of the platform? What are we, what are you developing? And we had that conversation about, what was going to make the news. And also, but at that time, we were trying to strike a balance with what was going to be of interest to media. So kind of what challenge at this stage is Thrixon addressing, but also that, those earlier points which Shavit made about getting the Thrixon brand out there, the funding story and the technology platform as a whole. But then from a media's side, and my perspective, that's not just quite enough. It's like, okay, what's going to be the first kind of product or service we're offering? So we had to kind of tease a bit of that in there, but we had that discussion at the time about how much the first application was going to play in this story. And I think we struck a really good balance, because hopefully when we get to commercial stage, we'll be able to talk about that in a lot more detail, and that will then be the story at that time. So there are lots of things to consider, even just in those, what you think are quite straightforward stories, when they're not, because it's all about what are we building, when are we building, and when are we going to when's the opportunity to re-engage the media again. Let's not put it all out there, all up front, and say everything today. And we'll be able to build our brand awareness and presence as we go along the journey. So I think just an example there, I think, about how that played out.
No, and I think you brought us to the next point pretty nicely, which is really the whole concept of I think public relations, right? Because media is not going to cover a startup once a month. That's just too much. And I don't think there'll be enough news for media agency to even cover that much news over a startup itself. So I think you've also brought up what counts as good PR, right? But how does a startup exactly get noticed? Is it only during key fundraising amounts at each of the various stages, or how does one really go to craft out their good PR strategy, you would say?
There are definitely what we all refer to as milestones that make it worthwhile to kind of engage with external stakeholders. But again, and I feel like when we've been in this game for a long time, we talk to startups, it's like PR or marketing and branding is kind of a luxury. But honestly, I think early investment in it can actually really pay off, because often we kind of get those ad hoc kind of piecemeal requests like, okay, let's do the funding announcement. And you're like, okay, what's your story? What's the narrative? What's your brand story? And often when we're engaging startups, they don't have it. Not everybody, but often they don't have it. They're just like, well, we just wanted to get the funding announcement. But often, and I think sometimes from PR consultancy's perspective, it's like, oh, you're just trying to make a bigger project, for more revenue, whatever. But genuinely was, starting at the beginning, what is the story? What's your brand narrative? Have we thought about that? Because otherwise, it's just a funding announcement today that's going to be what we would call a one-hit wonder. And you're not really, you'll get visibility in, say, in the space of a week, and then it'll die down. But what are you doing to really put yourself out there and use that opportunity, as Thrixon did, to build the greater awareness of the brand as a whole, not just the funding announcement? So I think to me, it should start at the beginning, even if it's just to engage on, we break it down, you can do project by project, it doesn't have to be this massive annual investment, right? Let's sit down, let's workshop your narrative, let's workshop the words that you want to use to describe yourself, let's look at what competitors are doing, and let's pen down your story and your key messages. What is it I want to communicate? And then we can leave it there, right? And then we can hit the milestones, right? If we're going to go, or even if we want to start thinking about, how do I attract investors? What do I need to do? And again, it might not just be media. Shavit mentioned earlier, like which, who within the healthcare ecosystems do we need to be, networking? There's a lot more to PR outside of just media work, right? We have a lot of networks and connections. It could be industry chambers. It's network events. It's people that actually we know within our sphere that we can do introductions to. There's lots of other things to consider. And then you can kind of get to your funding announcement. Of course, then you kind of think about your product, the service, when it's ready, it's go commercial. Could be significant talent hires. Also an opportunity to talk about how the company is progressing. So there are lots of different elements, but I think, for me, if you don't have your kind of unique value proposition down, and knowing what you want to communicate at any of those milestones, then you're kind of not going to be able to build that kind of long-term brand awareness and visibility and brand equity that you need as you go along.
And I think it's definitely a very valid point. And I think some of the concepts of that might be really abstract for some of our audiences as well. So I wanted to maybe flip it over to take a look at it from a founder and CEO perspective, right? I think based on what Emma has mentioned, when did you actually begin to think, I will be doing my fundraising in March, right? At which point in time did it really hit you that, okay, I really need to start planning this PR release together with somebody?
I think that the PR release is sort of the end of the story, right? It's not really that's kind of, we've done the fundraise, we've done all the other work, and that's just the kind of the cherry on top. I think that Emma touched on a really important point, which is the narrative side of it. And that starts long before. So, I think you're going to have a very hard time getting to the point where you can make a funding announcement, because to raise funds, you're going to have a very clear narrative. So it starts very early on. And for most startups, one of your earliest sort of, forays into anything that is marketing, PR, or branding is going to be when you start to engage with investors. Having that story down to the point where your messaging and your communication is clear, it's succinct, and it makes sense, and it resonates with your audience, that's the first and most important thing. So if you don't have that down, if that's not in a place that you're feeling really comfortable with, that it's resonating with your audience, then there's no point doing any of the other stuff or spending any money on, marketing, PR, etc. That's the most foundational thing. And I think that's kind of the important part that you absolutely cannot skip. And that matters a lot more than, how much money you spend on a logo or any other kind of communication. So I think that's a really, really key point there. For us, the journey that we went through was initially, very much investor facing. We had to raise money, so we had to go out to investors, we had to tell our story. And, probably, most founders on this call will resonate with this, but we went through countless iterations of our deck when I say iterations, that means pretty much rebuilding it from scratch and fine-tuning that story until it got to the point where it was resonating with the people that we were speaking to. And it was only once we did that and we said, okay, we're comfortable with our messaging, it's getting across, people are seeing the vision that we're trying to present to them, that we said, now's the time to really double down on this. Let's go and make a big announcement. Let's try to capitalize on the momentum that we have. But if you don't have that foundational piece, then you're wasting your time, trying to do something like that, because, as Emma said, maybe you'll get picked up in a, someone might just sort of copy paste your press release, but that's not really going to generate any interest or any follow-up. And I think, when you are at the stage where you're going to do a press release, I think one of the most important things, and this is something that we did a lot of work with Emma on, was being very clear on your objectives for this press release. So what is the audience that you're trying to engage with? And then making sure that the message that you're crafting for that press release is specific and is going to resonate with them. Because, initially you say, look, I want to get into all the newspapers, I want to be in scientific publications, I want to be in business publications, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very hard to tell a story that's going to be interesting to all of these different stakeholders. So, for us, the consideration was, who are the stakeholders that we want to engage with right now that it's important for us to engage with, and who the story that we have to tell right now is going to be most interesting to. So we spent a lot of time figuring out what that audience looked like and making sure that the message that we were communicating was, delivered to that audience in a way that's going to be interesting to them and generate the follow-up. And the follow-up isn't just, news articles. It's, who do we engage with as a result of those news articles? So for us, we were very clear on, we wanted to engage the business and investment community, because right now our announcement is a funding announcement. We're not announcing clinical trial results or anything like that yet. So the story that we have to tell right now is interesting to investors, and we wanted to make sure that we're using this to be, put our company on the radar with the kinds of investors and the kinds of stakeholders that we're interested in engaging with. And then the measure of success to that is, do we successfully get that engagement with that target audience beyond the press articles, et cetera?
Yeah. And I think, sorry, I want to go back to a couple of points, but I think just building on that, like, ultimately then we didn't do so much of it, but Shavit himself used the media coverage to amplify in his social channels, and that, I believe, from what I saw, got a huge amount of engagement. It's kind of, it's the whole conversation loop, like not just the one-off piece, and again, I know budgets are limited and we are not trying to be kind of evasive when we're like, oh, don't just do it as an ad hoc exercise. Think about, and we don't have to do it all. Again, like Shavit is like, listening to that as an ideal client, I'm like, might not be able to like do any more projects with you. You got it down pat. Perfect client for us, but in kind of aligning expectations. But that story, just going back to the story building and the narrative, and whether we do it or you do it internally, when we got to the media engagement, and I think kind of the secondary audience kind of being the MedTech or tech focused publications, in order to start seeding, oh, these guys are coming and this is the challenge that they're currently looking to address. And I remember the journalist kind of commenting, Shavit has his pitch down pat, but it doesn't come across salesy. So this is the other thing. So your investor story, your story building and how you tell it to investors, I'm sure Shavit will know better than I, is one way. Then you kind of have to then take, how do I going to tell that story to the media? But Shavit it's so fluid, because we had the story from the start. So it still applies. The media have the same questions. Why is this going to be successful? What is the challenge you're addressing right now? What's the size of that, market? How, what do you think market revenue is going to be? What's the size of the problem? All of these data points are in the investor deck. Here's the size of the market we're addressing. So you can give the same information to the media as part of your story. obviously how you tell it in a non-salesy way whilst engaging a journo around the story. So we led with the problem, right, Shabir? Like, AMR, this is a problem. This is what we're going to hope to address. And then we kind of, we built the story and we told the journo who we are and where we're going. So that story, I cannot say, when people come and say, can you just do the press release? Like, okay, what's your story? Well, the story is funding. No, your story's not funding, and I can sense a little bit of frustration. It's like, oh, this is gonna take me more and longer than I thought it was. And it's like, yes, because, well, as we know, anything worth doing is worth doing well.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll get that right. So, I think that's really, really important. And then, as Shavit said, I don't know how much kind of, one-on-one direct engagement there was post kind of the work that we did, but just that reach via social channels, I'm sure kind of, really put Thrixon on the radar, and using that kind of what I would call kind of the hero piece in BT, the Business Times, I think was, really key to kind of more awareness.
I think one point I would add is, when it comes to timing, obviously, so when you close a round, you want to get a press release out ASAP, and there's a lot of pressure, to do that quickly. And I think one of the things that I think we did right on this one was not give in to pressure and just say, we want to get this right, and it's more important that we do this correctly than that we do it. If the press release goes out this week or next week, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a difference. But if you take the time, make sure that you have all your ducks in order, and you're really doing it when you're ready. I think that's important, because if you're investing in this, you need to make sure that you're seeing, the return on it, and you're putting your best foot forward. So I think that's an important point, is don't rush it. Make sure that you're ready and go to market when you're feeling like you have all of the pieces in place.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you brought up ROI as well, and how that press release helped you to get potentially to know more investors, right? And I guess that's why maybe yourself and Emma have also chosen E27, TIA, and BT as sort of the main platforms that the target audience of the investors would generally be at and be reading itself. And I think quite a lot of our audiences are also fundraising at the current moment, right? So would you say it's a matter of closing a fundraising round first and then looking to craft out that or to release that PR media piece? Or would you say it's a case whereby you're relatively confident you would close this funding round, and you should already begin preparing that actual article and the actual strategy for release itself? So I guess, which comes first, right? The chicken or the egg?
I think specifically when it comes to a fundraise, I think you want to make sure that your fundraise is properly closed before you go and do any kind of release. I think focus on doing that first. I think if it's a question of just general kind of PR and generating interest in the company, I think it's a question of what do you have to tell. So, for a lot of startups, the newsworthy kind of stories that you have to tell are going to be relatively limited in an early stage. So if you go out and sort of release every small progress that you've made or anything like that, you're just not really going to get a lot of interest. Certainly not from mainstream media. Maybe if you're very good at posting on LinkedIn, for example, and you have an engaged audience and you do that well, that's great. If you can generate momentum that way, that's fantastic. But certainly from sort of a kind of traditional media PR, I think what you want to do is save up until you really have enough that has real meat in it for an announcement. Otherwise you're just not going to get any traction with it.
Yeah. There's no news. I mean, explicitly from the media side, there's no news. I think there are ways to do it in a non-media way. If you want to start establishing yourself pre-funding, we can talk about content. We can talk about, dare I say, thought leadership, the insights, starting to put yourself out there. And that could be done by LinkedIn, for example, if that's where your audience is. And again, let's not think we've got to start with the audience. Who am I trying to reach? Where are they? Are they reading the newspapers? Are they on LinkedIn? Those are considerations. But, you can start with what we would call compelling content, you know, to start to get recognition that way. PR doesn't equal news. It doesn't equals media, you know. Often we're looking at story, narrative, messaging, where your audience is, how do we reach them, which are the platforms. And again, that I know, you know, we talk about Asia Pacific, and the, you know, that's going to differ across multiple markets. But yeah, there are other ways. There are other ways to do it if you want to generate, you know, investment interest outside of media.
And
And
I
also,
think
and also the networking. I mean, again, not my, you know, not my domain, but I'm sure Shavit's done a lot of it. Like, who do I need to know? Where do I need to be? Who do I need to engage in conversation? You know, we often forget face-to-face is, particularly in Singapore, it's easy to do as well.
No, yeah, reminds me of the time we spoke to one of our alumni as well, who was really focused on getting the technology closer to clinicians. And I guess what he did was really to work with a lot more of the university and the scientific journals, and contribute their technology towards that aspect of it. And so instead of branding his company and really focusing on that, they focused more on how the technology was able to help value add other technologies that the universities were also spinning off. And that seems to be working out for him as well. Which I think leads me to the next question I have, right? And it's a question we get pretty often, which is that MedTech companies typically stay in a stealth mode until a certain period of time before they're ready to say, okay, well, you know, this is what we're doing, this is our story, this is our product, or our technology, and what we are able to do as well. Would you say there is a period of time where MedTech startups are staying silent for too long, or is there like a golden opportunity period to come up and really share this news with the world?
I guess for me, probably the funding is always the first milestone. And you need to be talking about that. I think sometimes the challenge with funding announcements can be the amount. Media like big numbers, and there is a certain, I guess, number that's deemed kind of too low to be reporting on. Of course, it also depends on the news cycle of that day. You know, you might get lucky, you might get your, you know, your 2 million fundraising announcement covered. Not likely. We need to be pushing kind of up, you know, towards the 10 mark, I think, for a decent announcement. But also, again, not just the number. What's your story? You know, how compelling is the story that you're telling along with the funding announcement? Look, I think I've seen it both ways. I've seen startups try to come out too early with a view actually to drive commercial interest. That's not what PR is going to help with. Not in the very early days. You know, if you're looking for PR to drive your sales in those early days, not likely, not our role. And then I think there are some that probably stay too late. And the danger of staying in stealth mode too long is that you have other competitors that are coming out. So there's something to be said for maybe first mover advantage as well. Of course, it's when timing's hard to call, but you don't want to spend your time trying to, you know, define your narrative and differentiate from what's already out there. There is something to be said to be the first one out there with your story, and then others have to differentiate themselves from you. Again, comes back to what space are you in, or are you innovating something entirely new? You're first to market. Again, like lots of considerations to, but I do think that you need to think about what story you've got to tell at what time. But I don't know if Shavit has a.
I think so. First of all, when we say stealth mode, you know, I guess there's a question of what do we mean by that? So obviously there's stealth mode, which is, you know, you put on LinkedIn, I'm a founder at Stealth, and, you know, you don't talk to anybody about what you're doing, versus, you know, saying, look, we have a website, we communicate minimally. You know, we're not going out there and proactively pushing things out, but we have a presence, we're around. You know, I think there's a spectrum. My personal feeling on it is I don't believe in the concept of, you know, being in stealth mode. For if you've started a company and you have an idea and you know what you're doing, then get out of stealth mode. You know, I think it's important that you're engaging with just people in general, because that feedback that you get from everyone you speak to, whether it's investors, potential customers, or friends and family, is incredibly important to you as a founder in an early part of the journey. So I think that getting that feedback is important. And if you're being too stealthy about what you're doing, you're sometimes depriving yourself of a lot of that feedback that can be very valuable. But I think when it comes to proactive communication, I think, you know, as Emma said, there's a time and place for it. You have to be ready. You have to have something that's engaging and be ready to do that. But I think that for a lot of companies, the right place to be in is one where you have a presence, where people can find you online. They can find maybe a website that, at least at a high level, allows people to understand what the problem you're solving is, and maybe, you know, a little bit about your technology or your solution, so that if anyone is interested, they can contact you, they can find out more, but you don't yet have to be proactively trying to, you know, get media coverage or publicize anything or do anything of that nature.
I think, yeah, it is really a balance between that, striking a balance between the competitive edge, maintaining that, but also, yeah, having something to say.
That fine balance, right, between both sides.
Really hard.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, I would say, maybe one of the more difficult aspects of achieving this as well. And of course, I know that Trixon is interested in the US market, right? And with you guys being the inaugural cohort for the US Market Access Program. But with you also based in Singapore, do you see any particular differences with regards to PR strategy, for example, US versus APAC?
Is that for me? Or is it for Trixon?
Yeah, maybe for Trixon first.
Sure. I think, you know, for us, it's a little bit early to say because we've not yet really engaged in a PR effort in the US. Our initial PR effort was more aimed at Singapore,
APAC.
sort of the ecosystem more regionally. So I would probably defer to Emma in terms of any kind of you know, major differences there.
Yeah. Look, I've spent nearly 2 decades in Asia working across what is a very disparate region. I have worked in global agencies on global campaigns where you know, obviously the US is included. They are, I mean, Asia in itself is incredibly different when it comes to PR. I mean, we know this, you know, it's obvious to everyone. China, you know, different channels, different platforms, even Japan, you know, highly parochial market, you know, has to have local language, you know, Indonesia, you know, they use X, Singapore don't care about X, you know, LinkedIn works across a lot, you know, so does TikTok, you know, there's different channels, different markets. The US is a huge market. The one thing I would say is, and you know, when I worked with clients in Asia that either wanted to go to the US, even the magnitude of the US market and what it takes to execute a PR program there, the levels of budget we're talking about in itself are hugely different. Yeah. So when we used to tell clients that, you know, you'll need to be looking at kind of monthly retained at X, and they'd be like, that's kind of my whole PR budget for that, you know, whatever. But you know, to do all market Asia, you know, again, Japan is very expensive. China's a huge market, but you know, the journalists are different. You know, I would say, you know, in some markets in Asia, the journalists are quite soft. The US journalists are not forgiving. You know, you have to, you know, if you want to talk to the big guys, you've got to be ready, you know, and that comes down to everything, to being able to be media trained, difficult questions, all of that. The landscapes are very, very different. The US market is very, very competitive. Of course, healthcare in itself is, you know, is a hot issue. You know, being able to just no one wants to talk about your products, no one wants to talk about your services. You know, what are the issues? You know, what's your bigger viewpoint of the healthcare ecosystem, the healthcare industry? There's a lot to think about, particularly in the US market, where the media want to speak to savvy people who can provide the insights, who aren't just going to give them a sales pitch. That is my experience. Same with Europe to a large extent. Somewhere like London, also, you know, the media very, you know, very ruthless. But yeah, and also let's not forget the regulatory landscapes of all of these markets and what that means for communications. because what you can and can't do in the US versus here. I mean, I would say some of the regulatory stances from a media comms perspective here, somewhere like Singapore, very strict, even South Korea. US is that you can actually probably do a lot more in the US in healthcare comms in terms of branding than you can here. There's a lot of restrictions, so you've got to think about regulatory restrictions as well.
Yeah, and I guess maybe my major takeaway for this would really be just take it step by step, right? You don't really have to conquer all your markets at once, kind of similar to business development, but really understand where you want to be and how best to position yourself in the markets that you want to be in at the right time itself as well. Okay, so I think we are left with 5 minutes. I'm just going to ask a really simple question, and that is, in both of your opinions, right? At which stage does it make sense for a MedTech or a digital health startup to appoint either a professional PR firm or create an in-house kind of marketing team? Because I know, Shavit, you are now the one man that's doing marketing, PR, and fundraising and all that, right? So what do you think is really that sweet timing to either create that in-house marketing team or outsource?
So I think that the first thing is, that we talked about is kind of the narrative and the messaging. My personal view is that that's something that you need to do yourself.
As a founder, right?
As a founder. I mean, you can get some help with it. You can engage someone who can maybe help to direct you and help you to formulate that if that's something that you're, not comfortable doing or you don't have the experience doing. But I think that until you have that down to a really good level, then there's no point in spending money on engaging, a branding agency to do any kind of work or anything like that. When it comes to things like the visual aspects of a brand, your logo, your collaterals, etc., there's a lot of free tools out there right now that can get you to a pretty decent point very quickly. I would say utilize those as much as possible. When you're at a point where your messaging is good, you have a foundation to what it is that you're doing, and you're ready to take it to the next level and you have the resources to invest in it, then you can engage an agency at a point where you already have that clarity. Because I think, an agency is not going to be able to, if your narrative isn't cohesive, if it's not coming together, they're not going to be able to solve that for you, because you're the one who knows the problem that you're addressing, the solution, the technology. You have to be able to convey that. They can help you to fine tune it and polish it, but they can't do that for you. So I think that's kind of foundational, being able to get to that point before you start engaging, the same way that, if you're developing a product, you need to get to a certain level before you go and engage a manufacturer or something like that. I would look at it the same way.
And so Emma kind of amplifies the messaging and the story and of what you guys are doing.
Yeah. It's sort of taking it, professionalizing it, taking it to the next level. In terms of hiring someone to do that work, I think that there's the question of when there's a volume of work that justifies it. So when you have enough outgoing communication, enough things that it makes sense now to bring someone in to do that, which again will be different for different companies. I think when you're at the stage where you are commercial and you're starting to sell and you have a need for that, then obviously that makes sense. And I think that's something that you tie with the sort of the ROI on those activities. So bring in a marketing person when you have a clear set of objectives to give them an tangible outcome that you're after with that.
I think just 2 points from me on that. In the context of how I think about when I'm approaching clients all the time and clients I work with on a daily basis, what value am I delivering as an agency? Why is the client engaged to us? What do we offer that they can't do themselves? I do think I hear Shavit on the kind of development of the campaign narrative. I think there is also merit in the outside in that we have, having seen and worked with a lot of clients and speak with the journalists and what's different. So I think bringing the outside in at that stage can be useful and important. And often as founders, you're very excited about what you're developing, you're very excited about your brand, and you're like, and then you kind of have to pause and go, okay, what? Well, hopefully kind of through market research and the development cycle, you'll know what's already out there, but kind of that, what else are other brands saying? Are you uniquely different? Really, we really challenge the client, are you really saying something different? Are you doing something differently? So I think that is where an external consultant or agency can come in and really help refine the process and give that objectivity. The second thing is, to my point about what do we have that maybe you don't, and in our case, when we're working with Thrixon, it's media relationships, right? That's our bread and butter. We have a network of media that we know, we live and breathe daily. We can pick up the phone to, hey, you're interested in the story. That's kind of bread and butter. And that's probably something that a lot of companies don't have that we would be engaged for. We have a large database of media to reach out to. So yeah, they're my couple of things that I think it's not always about timing. We have talked about that, but it's also skill set and capability, and what other elements can we bring as an external party.
I know, thank you so much to the both of you. I think we've come to the end of the webinar. Maybe any final tips or advice you'd like to offer startups as they really embark to really rethink this portion of their company? Shavit, do you want to start first?
Yeah, sure. I think don't rush it. I think have a very iterative approach to what you're doing. Test your messaging, test out what you're doing, make sure that you're at a point that you feel like it's resonating and it's good. And when you reach that stage, then it's time to sort of put the foot on the gas pedal and put the investment behind it. But I think that, treat your marketing and PR and branding the same way that you would treat product development, which is constantly testing, learning, and fine-tuning.
And reiterating. Emma?
I think for me, be ready in the sense of, having, knowing what story you want to tell, what your objective is. I think have a clear understanding of what PR can achieve for you. Again, I think coming back to the differences between branding, brand management, PR, marketing, advertising, be really, really clear on what PR is and what it can achieve. And ensure that expectations are aligned. And again, Shavit and I talked a lot, again, on the surface, funding announcement, but Shavit and I talked a lot about what the objectives were, who the audience was, making sure that we were aligned, and I was on the same page in terms of, we weren't really looking for volume. If you're looking for volume these days in media, it's hard. The media pools are getting smaller, but we were after quality as well and in the right places. So be really aligned on your expectations, whether you're working with somebody internally or externally. And listen, just another thought as I think about kind of market entry and comms in different markets. I think about that bigger picture if you can, or have the agency bring that in. We've got a lot of geopolitical dynamics right now. We've got a lot of protectionism in local, championing local brands. As a company, you're doing comms, say in a new market, you need to think about what are you bringing to that new market? Foreign direct investment is really kind of important as a point. Like, what are you contributing to the market as well? What else are you doing to benefit it versus just trying to sell your products and services? These all play into your story. And you have to be cognizant of them as you go into each, particularly in Asia Pacific.
No, I think all fair and good points. So once again, thank you so much, Emma and Shavit. For our cohort companies, please stay behind, and Bernice, trouble you to end the webinar.